The manhwa begins with an African mercenary camp in the middle of the forests. Their superior informs them of their mission, which is to assassinate a target. One of the protagonist's companions, named Daeru, asks him what the superior is saying because he doesn't understand. The superior gets angry because of the noise, but then makes eye contact with the protagonist, which intimidates him, and continues the explanation. In a scene change, we see the mercenaries arrive in the forest, and we discover that the protagonist is their captain. He tells them to prepare and then they venture into the forest. However, after 2 kilometers, the protagonist orders his squad to stop because he has a bad feeling. One of his men, named Smiters, asks if he's scared and mocks him. Suddenly, a shot hits Smiters in the chest, and a hail of bullets is unleashed against the squad. The protagonist drags Smiters behind a tree while telling the others to take cover. An explosion detonates right behind them, and the protagonist thinks that those people were waiting for them. More enemies appear on vehicles, and the protagonist takes down those on one, causing them to crash into a tree. The protagonist tries to attend to Smiters' wounds, but he tells him to go and leave him. This makes the protagonist angry, and he asks Smiters to tell him who he is, to which he responds that he is the God of Blackfield. Then the protagonist tells Daeru that they will reach the enemy headquarters and leaves his cover to attack. Suddenly, he receives a shot in the head and says it came from behind, so they must have betrayed him. But his thoughts don't stop, and he wakes up in a hospital bed in Korea, wondering where he is. The protagonist asks the doctor where he is, and the doctor tells him he is in a hospital in Korea, where he has been in a coma for 3 years. The doctor asks to call the protagonist's guardian, but upon seeing his confused attitude, he decides to keep him longer. Suddenly, the protagonist stands up and runs towards a mirror, where he realizes that his appearance is different. Later, we see the protagonist in a car, where he tells us what he has learned about his situation. He explains that he was the leader of the French mercenaries in 2016, until he was killed by an ally during the African War. He woke up in 2019, at the age of 19, in the body of a student named Kang Chan. Meanwhile, Kang's parents, now the protagonist's parents, take him to their house. Once inside, the protagonist tries to enter his room but doesn't know which one it is, so his parents show him. They are worried because they think he has lost his memory. The protagonist is happy to be in a good place and tries to use the computer, but he doesn't know the password. He then tries to use the phone, but the same thing happens until he manages to unlock it with his fingerprint. He tries to search the internet for information about his death in the war, but he finds nothing. Suddenly, he receives a message from someone named Jun asking if he had left. The protagonist plays along and responds yes, to which Jun replies, then why didn't he say so, and asks him if he really wants to get messed up. The protagonist then deduces that he is not a friend, so he decides to ignore him. This makes Jun angry and he calls the protagonist, who just laughs at his threats and hangs up when he told him to come out. Later, we see Jun furious on the school rooftop, throwing his phone because the protagonist blocked him. He challenges him to come to school and says he will make him buy him another phone. Back with the protagonist, he says he didn't find any information about the war in Africa. He then says he needs a cigarette and starts looking for one in the room. But instead, he finds Kang's diary, where he discovers that Jun and the others bullied him, and he wished to kill them. In a scene change, we see the protagonist the next day at school, where he says he needs someone to help him. He then meets Jun, who threatens him again, and the protagonist smiles because he says he found his assistant. The protagonist asks if he smokes and asks for a cigarette. Jun tells him to come with him since he needs to teach him a lesson. He takes him to the gym where he starts punching the air and tells him that he had to go through a lot because of his absence. Suddenly, the protagonist punches him and tells him he talks too much. Jun attacks the protagonist, but he dodges his blows and punches him in the face. However, he realizes that it's not enough because it's not his body, so he has to keep punching him until he falls, and he succeeds. He stops because he has to go to class. In a scene change, we see the protagonist at the entrance of the school, where he meets a girl named Kim Myo. She apologizes for not visiting him and tells him that everyone in class was worried about him. The protagonist wonders what Kang's relationship with her was, so he asks her to guide him to the classroom. There, Jun appears again, and the protagonist understands that they're in the same class. In another scene change, we see the group in sports class, where the teacher tells the protagonist that he can do whatever he wants as long as he doesn't hurt himself. Jun approaches him, tells him to come with him again, and takes him to his group of bullies, who surround him and prepare to attack him. But he tells them to do it all together because he is lazy. Then one of the bullies tries to hit him, but the protagonist hits him before he can, which surprises the group. There, the protagonist teaches them how to attack a single target in a group, but they ignore him and say he was just lucky. So the protagonist easily dodges and hits them. Then, the first bully who hit him gets up and grabs the protagonist by the hair, despite dodging his attack again. The protagonist is surprised that he managed to get up, and says it's because his body is weak, but he still manages to knock him down. Ha-jun wonders how that happened, and if it's the same person he knew, when one of the bullies pulls out a knife and attacks the protagonist with it, but he manages to dodge it again and disables his arm. Then, he takes the knife and tells Ha-jun that this time he won't let him go. The bully begs and says he won't mess with him again. Suddenly, the sports teacher appears and tells the protagonist to stop, as he has exceeded the limit of self-defense, and will be expelled if he continues. He urges him to leave and continue the conversation later about where he learned to fight. In a scene change, we see the protagonist cutting his hair like in his other life and going to eat, when he receives a call from his mother who asks him what happened today. He replies that he will tell her when he gets home. The protagonist hangs up and says that he shouldn't treat them that way, but that it's better than suicide. Then we see him arrive home, where his father angrily demands an explanation from him. The protagonist comes out of his room and shows them Kang's journals. This shocks them, and he explains that he got revenge because he lost his fears when he woke up. Then his father tells him not to worry and that he will handle the incident, but he has to tell them if they torment him again. There the protagonist remembers his own parents and that his father was an alcoholic, so he promises. Suddenly his father receives a call, in which a French contact is stuck in customs because he lost his documentation. The protagonist returns and asks his father for the phone to negotiate for him, and starts speaking in French with the person in charge. After a while, the protagonist hangs up and tells his parents that everything has been resolved. They are surprised by his ability and ask him where he learned French, to which he replies on the internet. Then we see the protagonist in his room, who says he will have to postpone his return to France because of his injury. But he hesitates for a moment to return, thinking of his new parents, although he later says he will have to do it without hesitation. The next day we see the protagonist at school when Ha-jun arrives with his group and tells him to follow him because he will kill him today. The protagonist tells them to get lost when Ha-jun reveals that they have Kim Myung. But the protagonist says he doesn't know who it is, then Ha-jun explains and the protagonist remembers that it's his friend. So he asks where she is. Ha-jun takes him to the rooftop, where he finds another group of bullies and some girls, and tells them to leave. But one of them gets angry and asks him who he thinks he is, so the protagonist punches her and tells her to leave or she'll die. She looks at Ha-jun, who tells her they'll play with him now, so they should leave and close the door. She tells him to make him pay and live a hellish life, and the protagonist asks where Myung is. But then we see her arrive at the classroom, where she says she's late because she missed the bus. So Ha-jun tells the protagonist that they tricked him and she's not there, to which he responds that it's good and he's leaving. But the bullies surround him, and Ha-jun asks him if he's afraid to jump again. Then the protagonist understands that it was them who forced Kang to jump, and Ha-jun confirms it. So the protagonist says they should have told him earlier. Ha-jun tells him not to act tough, and that the strongest guys in Korea are there to deal with him. Then one of them approaches the protagonist and asks if it's true that he's so strong, to which he responds yes and knocks the guy down. So Ha-jun yells at everyone to go after the protagonist, but he knocks them down before they can attack him. One comes from behind with a knife, but the protagonist takes it away and breaks his finger, and he's alone with Ha-jun again, telling him he hasn't learned anything and that he'll treat him like the shit he is. But then the teacher appears again, telling Ha-jun and the others to leave, and the protagonist says he's not a normal teacher. He explains to the protagonist that Myung told him what was going on, but the protagonist recognizes something familiar in him and wonders if he's Daeru, who could have experienced the same thing he did. So he attacks him to check. Both dodge and block each other's attacks, until they end up with their fists in front of their faces, and the teacher wonders how a high school student can fight like that. Then the protagonist asks him who he is in English, and they both respond at the same time, God of Blackfield. Then Daeru explains to him that something similar happened to him, as he also died during the battle and woke up in Korea. Then the protagonist asks him for a cigarette, but he refuses because he is a student. And the protagonist thinks that Daeru's reincarnation happened more or less at the same time as his. Then he asks him why the situation with the bullies keeps getting worse, and the protagonist replies that it's because they keep coming after him. But it doesn't matter because soon he will go back to France to look for the traitor. Daeru suggests they go together during the holidays, but the protagonist tells him to stay and live in peace, and to help solve the situation with the children. However, Daeru explains that it is not a children's matter as there is a criminal organization supporting them. The protagonist tells him they will continue the conversation later and goes to rest in the infirmary. Then Hajin appears and tells him that the protagonist is now the leader of the school while giving him food. Later, we see the protagonist walking through the school while everyone avoids him until he meets Myung, who asks him if he feels better. Then the group of girls appears again and tells the protagonist to go with them because someone wants to see him. But he ignores them and goes with Myung. She later warns him that the girl named Yunsul is targeting him and he should be careful. Then some bullies appear looking for the protagonist and tell him to come closer. Myung tells him not to go, but he replies that it's okay. However, when he approaches, the bullies tell him to get in the car and that they are not there to fight. They say they're there to talk, and the protagonist asks about what. This prompts one of the thugs to pat him on the head for acting tough, and the protagonist asks him to remove his hand. But the thug refuses, so he headbutts him and then knocks him down. One of the thugs is about to pull out a knife, but the boss tells him not to, and to just give him a lesson so he learns who he's dealing with. Then two thugs surround the protagonist, and he says they're different from the boys because they know how to position themselves. They try to hit him, and we see that it's harder for the protagonist to handle them than the teenagers. But he manages to handle the two of them until the boss kicks him in the back. The boss insists he goes with them, but the protagonist refuses, so he says they must teach him a lesson first. The protagonist resists his hit and manages to twist his arm. At that moment, the other two are about to attack him when they see Myung calling the police and decide to back off. But then she tells him that she didn't actually call anyone, and they go eat instead. The next day, we see the protagonist bored in class. It ends, and we see a group arrive with him, who bow and give him a weekly payment. But the protagonist tells them to leave and not to do it again. Then another student arrives and tells him that the physical education teacher is looking for him. He says to the protagonist that he found out about the fight, and that he should not get into trouble again or he will be expelled. To which the protagonist responds that he can then go to Africa sooner. Then Daeru asks the protagonist to protect 4 students who are being bullied. At first, he refuses, saying that it will only make things worse for them. But Daeru offers to register him as a special athlete, so he only attends school in the morning and can sleep in classes. In addition, it will help him improve his current physique, so he accepts. Later, we see that the protagonist meets Yunsul, who tells him that the guys from yesterday did something to her, so she goes to talk to him. There, Yunsul tells him that if he doesn't go with them, they will cut Hajin's tongue and he can't call the police, because if he does, they will go after his family, and says she will do what he wants. So the protagonist accepts and tells her that he wants her to wash her face, not wear makeup from now on, and wear her uniform properly. Then he asks her to call the bullies. She does, and the boss is about to tell him where and when to meet, but the protagonist interrupts him and tells him it will be on Monday, to which the boss agrees, and the protagonist tells them to stop bothering Yunsul. So she offers herself if the protagonist ever needs anything, and he says she looks a lot like Smith. Then we see Myung catch up with the protagonist and ask him shyly how it went with Yunsul, to which he tells her that there is nothing between them, and they only talked about the fight. Then the protagonist realizes that Myung likes him, so he asks her, and she nods. And that's how the first part of this manhwa ends. If you have made it to this part of the video, let me tell you that you have been one of the few people to make it here, so comment the word soldier in the comments. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss any videos. With that said, see you in the next video.